So at this time, it is my pleasure and honor to call to the stage our administration panelists. The first panelist we will have is Catherine E. Lehman, who is the Assistant Secretary for Civil Rights at the U.S. Department of Education. Carol V. Mason, Assistant Attorney General, Office of Justice Programs at the U.S. Department of Justice. Latifah Lyles, who is the Director of the Women's Bureau at the Department of Labor. Myra Alvarez, who is the Director of State Exchange Group, Center for Consumer Information and Insurance Oversight, Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. Dr. Nadine Gracia is the Director, Health and Human Services, Office of Minority Health. And last but not least, Lynn Rosenthal, Senior White House Advisor on Violence Against Women. Now, this is a power panel, ladies and gentlemen. These are some of our top experts on these issues. And so also, I thought it would be wonderful to hear from Roy Austin. Roy recently came to the White House to be our Director for Urban Affairs, Justice, and Mobility. So he is going to serve as the moderator today. He'll be asking each of our panelists one question that they've been able to prepare and answer, and then we'll have a lot of time actually for dialogue with you in the audience. So looking forward to it. Come on up, Roy.
So before I got up here, Heather told me there's one rule, and that is you're very lucky to be here. And just enjoy that and don't say a whole lot. So with that, I'll take one point of personal privilege, and that is that I understand the importance of women having a voice, but I have an 8-year-old daughter who at 1:30 in the morning decided it was time for her to have her voice. And that was not the time for it, for that young woman. So with this amazing panel, let me start with, the big question is, and let me start with Latifah, please.
Sure.
The big question is, we know that the wage gap for women of color is worse than it is for white women. Mm-hmm. The question is why? Why is that?
Thank you so much, Roy, and thank you to Tina and Valerie for having me, and for all of you in the room who continue to do the great work that we're talking about today. And just a few data points I want to put out there before I answer that question. And I know a lot of us in the room know this, but I think the more we get into the data, when I say get into the data, we talk about the wage gap now across various demographics of women, which is great. But there are a lot of things that we don't talk about. The fact that the labor force participation rate for African American women was near 50% in 1930 is not something that people generally think about. There's a lot of conversations, and how we move these policy discussions together has a lot to do with what's changed. And in our communities, a lot of what we're hearing about the general population, some of these average numbers in terms of where women are as breadwinners or in the labor force, aren't really changes for women of color. It's been the status quo for decades, and I'm using the opportunity now to really, come out of the silence and say, these are persistent challenges for our community, and they continue to be, and they have been for decades. And that's why I'm so proud to be representing the Secretary of Labor, Tom Perez, today, who does this every day. It's how we can lift up the folks whom we care about the most, who are not necessarily going to get a fair shot or equal opportunity. And related to the wage gap, there's a lot of discussion about discrimination. We know that we can do a better job in stepping up what we can do in terms of enforcing the laws. There are a few things that this administration has done, including recently calling on the Secretary of Labor to call on federal contractors to submit wage data. That's a very key piece of the Paycheck Fairness Act, is how do we know we're being discriminated against if we don't know how much we earn? But in addition to discrimination, occupational segregation is probably the other area that has probably the most major impact. During the 50th anniversary of the Equal Pay Act last year, the Equal Pay Task Force, along with the Department of Labor and our partners, released a report, 50 years later, what's changed. And we know that occupational segregation, in particular for women of color, is critically important. What does that mean? It means that when you hold for all other things, when when women are able to move into jobs that pay higher wages, you see a shrinking of the wage gap. Also, when we value the jobs we know women and women of color are in, we see a decrease in the wage gap. And I'm not just talking about getting women into STEM, which is of course extremely important, but how do we value and raise the wages where we know women of color are, and those are in service occupations, health occupations, education, and others. These are good jobs. They should be compensated as such. And one of the other very major accomplishments of this administration is, for the first time in decades, changing a rule that really is unconscionable when you think about it. My grandmother was a home care worker, and what I didn't know until I came to the Department of Labor is that she wasn't guaranteed minimum wage or overtime. A home care worker raising 7 kids on her own, and that's something that we're extremely proud of. Over nearly 2 million workers, the majority of whom are women of color, now have those basic protections. That makes a difference. We can show the numbers in terms of how that translates into an individual's ability to take care of their families and to take care of themselves.
So, Catherine, we've heard the numbers on the disparities on school discipline. Is this something that we can actually solve? Is there a policy solution to this?
Yeah, well, there has to be, right? The numbers we've heard, but I'm going to say them again because they're appalling. Our black girls are disciplined more than any other girls and more than most boys. 12% of our black girls suffer school suspension and school expulsion, and nearly 1 in 5 of our girls of color with disabilities suffer school suspension and expulsion. So those rates are wildly disproportionate to their numbers in school, and they send them a message that their schools don't want them, they're not welcome, and they can't learn there. So that has to change, and we know that we can solve it. What the research is very, very, very clear and consistent about is that our girls do not misbehave more than other students in school. So when we see these numbers of our girls out of school, we know that there's something else underneath those numbers that is sending a message, turning our kids away from school, doing harm to our girls, to all of our students in school. So there is a policy solution. We need to see it lived in the experience of students in every classroom all over the country. I'm so proud that last January, my office, together with the Department of Justice, released joint guidance package that is what the law is, the way that we enforce, what are best practices, and a 50-state compendium of laws around the country related to school discipline and what it is that we expect in school. So we've been very clear that we want to see a diminution in the out-of-school suspension and expulsion rates across the board, that we want to see alternative methods for keeping our kids in school, keeping them learning, making sure that all of our students are safe in their classrooms and welcomed in their classrooms. And we gave teachers at the elbow tools that they can use so that they have an alternative to pushing the kids out, and a way to keep the kids in school and to communicate to them high expectations. What we see in my office over and over and over again when we investigate underneath those numbers to take a look at what's happening in school is that the places for subjective decision making for school discipline are the places where our kids are harmed. So there will be 2 like offenses, somebody smoking, which I like as a mom that they not do, but one kid gets suspended, another kid gets talked to, or 2 like offenses, somebody pulling a fire alarm. Again, I'd rather they didn't do that, but one kid gets expelled from school, another kid does not. And the difference in choice divides on race lines too often. So what we want to see is somebody taking a look at those subjective decisions, somebody giving policy choices to the district. Sometimes the best practice is to delete the subjective basis for school discipline practices altogether, and to make sure that we're using research-based choices about what it is that we do to keep all of our kids safe in school and active and appropriate learners in school. So we want to raise our expectations for our students, we want to raise our belief about our students, and we want to send all of our students, our girls, our boys, all of our students, the message that we value them, we're prepared for them, and we will teach them in school.
So, Catherine, you mentioned the Department of Justice and the work that Department of Ed is doing with the Department of Justice. So, one thing to get expelled, suspended, a whole other thing to enter into the juvenile justice or criminal justice system. Carol, what can we do to keep girls and women from being disproportionately in the criminal and juvenile justice systems?
So one of the things we're doing is exactly what we're doing here today. So all of us sitting up here at this table together, we work together on these issues every day. So I think the biggest thing we can do is model what we're asking our communities to do, is to come out of our silos and recognize that we've got to treat this in a more holistic way. As we like to say, these are all of our children, these are all of our girls. It's not Catherine's girls, it's not Nadine's girls, it's all of our girls. And so we have to work collectively and look at the problems. So one of the things that I think that we are beginning to do better is to listen to the young people about what it is they need and why they're in these circumstances. So when you see this behavior that winds up in school discipline or winds up in our criminal justice system, what we ought to be doing is looking at what's really happening underneath the surface. Because typically what you'll find is these girls are victims. It's not anything they did that deserves for them to be treated as criminals. They need to be looked at as victims and figuring out what kind of services and resources do we need to bring around them, and what kind of services do we need to bring to increase their resiliency. So one of the things that we do in partnership with our peers here, as you've heard, the Department of Education and the Department of Justice are working together on what we call a supportive school discipline initiative to help educators understand the behaviors and understand that the path for girls into the justice system is very different than the path for boys. And again, typically underneath all of it is that they're victims. And so we're looking at how do we bring the right services to these young girls. A story that an experience that I had last week really, really moved me. I went to Miami and was visiting a child advocacy center, Christie House, and they have a program called the Gold Project for young girls 13 to 17 who are victims of child sex trafficking. Now, and they do this program, it's an after-school program where they come to this house that's in a neighborhood, and they come and they get counseling services, food, all kinds of different services. But I will tell you that if I didn't know that these girls were victims of child sex trafficking, I never would have known. We had straight A students, we had kids who wanted to be lawyers, kids who, they have dreams. That's the whole purpose of the program. It's called Gold, Girls Owning and Living Their Dreams. And so what I learned from that experience is listening to them and listening to them tell us what they need. They need for us not to talk at them, but to work with them and figure out what they need. And we need to see them as one of the young folks in our listening session we had on Monday about mentoring across the administration. They said, stop calling us youth at risk. I said, that doesn't make us feel good. And so they said, call us youth of promise, youth of hope. And so I say that we've got to think about the terminology that we use is really important. And we all recognize that they're vulnerable populations, and that's the way we see them, as vulnerable, and we have the best of intentions. We want to help them. But we've got to be careful about how our language is used so that they know that we really are helping them. And I should probably stop there because I could go on. This is, so I will leave it to the next person.
All right. So we do have a real doctor in the house here, not just a Juris Doctor. Nadine, what are the biggest health threats that are being faced by women of color these days?
Well, thank you, Roy, for the question, and it's wonderful to see all of you here and to participate on this panel. Certainly we see significant health disparities among women of color. We can look at chronic conditions such as heart disease, various forms of cancer, diabetes, but we also see it as well when we look at issues such as HIV, when we look at issues of access to quality care for behavioral health issues, whether it's mental illness or substance abuse. So the spectrum is quite wide. But what I appreciated actually in the last panel was also the discussion of where we're making progress. Because sometimes it's hard to stay in this work, in this fight, if you will, when all we hear are the disparities, but to know that there are areas in which we're making progress, and really what we need to do is also address how we accelerate that progress, how we amplify and leverage the collaborations that we can have to really improve in particular areas and certainly within health. And so seeing, for example, where in infant mortality, between the period of 2005 to 2011, we saw declines in infant mortality across the nation, and that the steepest decline was actually among African American infants. But we know that the disparity is still there. So seeing that it is possible to have these types of reductions, but that more work needs to be done to truly see the gap narrowing. Same with teen births. that we saw, for example, declines across all racial and ethnic groups. But again, the disparity is still there, where we see young girls of color that have twice the rate, for example, of teen births than others. And so we need to really think about how do we address these, certainly with the ongoing initiatives, but one is certainly the Affordable Care Act, and it's been mentioned already, and my colleague Myra Alvarez is going to speak in depth about the Affordable Care Act and how instrumental it is in promoting and protecting women's health. But also recognizing certainly the importance of collaboration and for us within the health field, talking about the social determinants of health and recognizing that it is not just health alone. It's not just going to the doctor's office and the experience that happens there, but it's issues such as education and poverty and transportation in communities and access to healthy foods. It's all of these very social determinants of health that also play a major factor in contributing to these health disparities. And so indeed, I agree with Carol's comment that we have to work together, certainly at the federal level, to be able to mirror that as well at the state and local levels, and to do so in partnership and recognizing the importance of local organizations, community organizations who have the trust of communities to be able to engage and provide this type of outreach and education, and working with communities and working with women and girls of color is vital, because that credibility goes a long way, especially when we're trying to deliver health care and try to deliver health messages. I'll also point out that as we move forward with these types of efforts and initiatives is to recognize the diversity between women and girls of color. So understanding when we talk about a lot of these data, the importance of recognizing the differences that we might see between Black girls versus Latinas versus Asian Americans, Native Hawaiians and Pacific Islanders, American Indians and Alaska Natives. That's also an advancement through the Affordable Care Act, is helping us to really tease out and understand the different populations so that our interventions can be most culturally appropriate, linguistically appropriate, and targeted to those who are facing the most significant disparities.
So thank you very much, Nadine. And if people aren't noticing, I'm really pretty irrelevant here as they make their own transitions. So Nadine really pretty much introduced, and that's what Heather's point was, is to make it clear that I was unnecessary. So Nadine, so Myra, you are to address the ACA.
Yes, gladly. And I also want to thank the White House for inviting me to be here with you today. I'm obviously inspired on a daily basis by the women across the country working to improve the health and well-being of our communities, and I'm just as inspired as by my fellow panelists and the work that they do. I want to
And your moderator.
Oh, sorry, definitely. I want to pick up where Tina left off, where she said, you can't talk about the accomplishments this administration has made for women and girls without mentioning the Affordable Care Act. If you look at any of our goals as a nation, whether it's ensuring kids succeed in school, ensuring we have strong businesses or strong communities, health is connected to every single one of those goals. And with implementation of the Affordable Care Act, we're giving women across the country one more tool in their work to improve their lives and the lives of their families. We've been able to see with the health insurance marketplace that millions of women have access to quality, affordable coverage that didn't have it before. But for the millions that did have it, that coverage is stronger with better consumer protections, and it's more affordable. We're presenting that opportunity for millions more come this Saturday, November 15th. The doors of the health insurance marketplace will open again to millions of people to renew their coverage if they want to come back and shop and find perhaps a more affordable option or an option that has a different network of providers. But for people that do not have health insurance that want to come in for the very first time to have the opportunity to walk through that marketplace to make an educated decision on health insurance. And what we're talking about is the security that health insurance provides. Because when you're talking about taking care of your kids and you're talking about working a 80-hour work week or a 50-hour work week, you need to be healthy. And oftentimes, health insurance was a huge barrier to making that happen. I think for all of us in this room, health and the idea of health insurance is personal. When we think about the doctor's office, we think about the people in our lives that we love, the people in our lives that we want to take care of and ensure that they're healthy. And that's instantly what I did when we passed the law and the president told us to move forward. I thought about my mom. My mom now takes care of my nephew during the week, and on the weekends, she cleans houses. She makes every dollar count. And I can tell you, if she had a choice between a $40 copay to get a mammogram, to check if something's wrong, or $40 to give my little sister to go to the movies or go on a school field trip, my mother's decision would be on the family. She'd pick my little sister first. She wouldn't put her health needs first. And I think millions of women across the country feel the same way. They prioritize what's in front of them, their children, their bills, food on the table, and put their health last. What the Affordable Care Act does is provide women the opportunity to put their health needs first and not worry about what costs may be in the way. Doing away with co-pays and co-insurance rates and deductibles for preventive services is telling our women to be empowered about their health care. And as a result of that, be able to prevent the illnesses that Nadine has said hits us the hardest across the country. It's a tremendous opportunity to ensure that millions of women have the opportunity to lead their healthiest life possible. And we're making that happen now. You know, the first year of the Affordable Care Act's health insurance marketplace, we saw 10.3 million people across the country gain health insurance coverage. We saw a drop in our uninsurance rate. We saw a drop in our deficit efforts related to healthcare, our spending around healthcare. So not only are we providing an opportunity for security, financial security, and the security that health insurance provides, but we're also investing in the long-term sustainability of our economy and our country's well-being. I think hand in hand, the Affordable Care Act is making that difference for women and for families across the country. And I'm going to put one more plug in for November 15th, Saturday, a couple days away, and encourage everyone to visit healthcare.gov or cuidadodesalud.gov if you prefer in Spanish, and invite someone that you know or someone that you love to visit that website and figure out what their options may be. On average, Americans spent $82 a month on their premiums last year with the coverage they got through the marketplace. $82 is less than what many of us pay for our cell phone coverage. And the security that health insurance provides is priceless. And today, or come Saturday, we'll have that opportunity to extend it to millions more women. And as a result of the voice that they have and the leadership role that they play in our families and our communities, to millions more Americans as well. So thank you very much for the opportunity.
Can we clap for that?
So thank you, Myra. And I spent years as a domestic violence and sexual assault prosecutor here in Washington, D.C., and so the work of Lynn Rosenthal is of particular importance to me. And Lynn, you know, we saw it here in D.C. that this domestic violence impacts women of color more so than other women. What is this administration doing about that fact?
Well, thank you so much, Roy, and we have found a place where you're not irrelevant, because much of our work in this administration has been engaging men and boys in their leadership and ending violence against women, and we've seen some incredible results. And also thank you to your work as a prosecutor addressing these issues. And, you know, I wanted to echo what Nadine said, and I should also say how much I admire all of you, because I've seen you all in action over many years, worked with many of your organizations, and I also have a chance to be on a panel of women in the federal government who've made amazing difference in the lives of women across the country. So my fellow panelists are brilliant, I have to say. But I want to echo what Nadine said, that communities of color, as you all know, I don't have to say this in this room, are incredibly diverse. And experience of violence really vary very much how violence happens, how it manifests, and what the appropriate interventions are based on culture, based on experience with external oppression, experiences with the law enforcement community, family dynamics, gender dynamics. So there's not one answer, but there is one piece of common ground, and that is that the solutions to violence are to be found within communities themselves. And our job really as the federal government is to create space, to clear space for that, and to appropriately resource that approach. That's been the approach of the Violence Against Women Act. That's been the approach of this administration. You'll note in this report, and as you heard from our panelists today, that the work on violence is comprehensive and it crosses all the sectors. So you won't find issues of violence only in the section of the report on violence against women, but in sections on health and economics and education as well. And that's been our approach. The hallmark of this administration's work has really been our partnerships with advocacy groups. The Department of Health and Human Services and the Department of Justice fund and actively partner with the Institute on Domestic Violence in the African American Community, the Asian Pacific Islander Institute on Domestic Violence, and the National Latina Network on Healthy Families and Communities, among many others. I also wanted to note, because Native American women are included in this report, that many Native American women are members of sovereign nations. And so much of that work is in support of women and also as government-to-government work as well. So it's positioned a little bit differently. And in a very significant reform, the Department of Justice, Carol's colleagues, and all of her hard work as well, the Department of Justice recommended to Congress that we close the jurisdictional gap and restore the ability of tribes to prosecute non-Native offenders of domestic violence. You can only clap after what was a prolonged battle on the Hill to get this done, but indeed it did happen, and it's really a credit to the leadership of Attorney General Holder and his team at the Department of Justice. We have been very concerned about the high rates of domestic violence homicide for all women, although I should say rates across the board for all racial and ethnic groups have dropped significantly since the passage of the Violence Against Women Act, but still 3 women a day are killed as a result of domestic violence, killed by spouses, former spouses, or boyfriends. And black women, in the cases of domestic violence where the offender is known, black women have 2.5 times higher rates of intimate partner homicides than white women. So this has really been an issue we've taken on in this administration because we have evidence-based tools to reduce domestic violence homicides. We know the warning signs, the indicators that the risk of homicide is increasing. You know, sometimes you see the headline and it sounds like it was just a tornado or something, you know, great tragedy, family killed, you know, man shot wife and kids and himself. But in fact, it wasn't an unpredictable tragedy. In many cases, it was very predictable. It wasn't like a natural disaster. There were warning signs that this was coming. And so we have evidence-based tools in general that can, with some limitations, reliably predict the risk of domestic violence homicide. Last year, Attorney General Holder and his team at the Department of Justice developed a program in 12 communities to implement these tools, to test out various models, to assess the readiness of communities to do this. And just last month, the Attorney General announced the second phase of this project in 4 communities specifically to implement these evidence-based tools, but also to ensure that we're linking these local sites up with communities of color so that the work is proceeding as it should with the populations that are at the highest risk. At the same time, the National Institute of Justice will be working with the Institute on Domestic Violence in the African American community and other culturally specific technical assistance providers to make sure that the tools that we consider today to be evidence-based are indeed evidence-based within communities of color. So you'll see that work unfold. It is my firm belief that we could cut this nation's domestic violence homicide rate more than in half if we consistently implement, evaluate, and scale up these interventions. I also wanted to note HUD's strong work on housing. In 2005, the Violence Against Women Act was expanded to include protections for victims of domestic violence in voucher-supported and public housing. This administration, as a part of our interagency work, recommended to Congress that those protections be expanded to 8 additional federally subsidized housing programs. Indeed, Congress responded. This is really a very significant reform. It means victims of domestic violence, dating violence, sexual assault, and stalking are protected against being evicted from federally subsidized housing, protected from being denied housing because they have a history of domestic violence or sexual assault. It's going to take a lot of work at the local level to implement these protections, but in HUD's 3 largest rental-based assistance programs, there are 9.8 million tenants, 3.3 million are women and girls of color. So this has an opportunity to very significantly affect the well-being of women and girls of color experiencing violence. We need help to make sure we get this right. I wanted to note our work on HIV/AIDS. You all know, as well as I do, that 75% of new infections among women are among women of color. What you may not know is that more than half of those women have experienced intimate partner violence. 2 years ago, President Obama created an interagency work group to address this intersection between violence against women, HIV/AIDS, and gender-related health disparities. I chair that along with the director of the Office of National AIDS Policy, and last year we released a report with 56 action steps to bring federal agencies together to improve care for women in HIV/AIDS care by addressing violence and trauma, which is often the driver of the epidemic in women, and to improve screening and concurrent screening for intimate partner violence and HIV/AIDS. Last month, we released our progress report. Please take a look at it. You can find it online. It's the progress report from the Working Group on HIV/AIDS, Violence Against Women, and Gender-Related Health Disparities. Just to draw your attention to one of the important projects in this progress report, the Office of Violence Against Women at Justice and HUD are working together to create a new transitional housing project for women living with HIV/AIDS. This is in the HOPWA program, who are also experiencing violence. So we'll keep you informed of how that moves forward. The Department of Health and Human Services has been working specifically on the intersection of economic advocacy and women's vulnerability to violence. And in fact, the Family Violence Office at the Department of Health and Human Services is in the middle of a 3-year initiative to create greater asset building. So they're working with the Assets for Independence program, some of you are familiar with, to help victims of domestic violence build assets so they have less economic vulnerability to abuse. There's much more I could talk about. I have to certainly mention President Obama's task force to protect students from sexual assault. This is an issue that's extremely important to President Obama and Vice President Biden. They've spoken about this very personally and also of leaders of our country. The task force started to look at sexual assault on college campuses, but it was very important to the president, the vice president, and attorney general, and the secretary that we think not just about sexual assault on college campuses, but sexual assault in K through 12 settings and in our communities. Not only the students, yes, it's worthy of a round of applause. Not only the students who are privileged enough to get to college and then experience this terrible trauma of sexual assault, but women and girls in all of our communities, including the most marginalized and vulnerable. So we started with a report in April on sexual assault on college campuses. Catherine and her team at ED have been really key leaders and drivers of that report. HBCUs were very critical in our process. We heard from HBCU students, from officials, and from alumni associations. I think if one of our listening sessions stands out in my mind, it was with HBCU alumni associations who said, we're there, we will help, we want to do work. Last month, President Obama, or in September, unveiled It's On Us, which is a bystander intervention campaign to take the burden off survivors and put it on all of us to help intervene in addressing sexual assault on college campuses. Roy, this is again where you come in. It's On Us is about engaging men and boys. I'll just end with a call to action. Vice President Biden, when we acknowledged the 20th anniversary of the Violence Against Women Act, spoke about the need to look again at women's equality and at the intersection of women's equality and race, and to look at women's experiences within the system. And so we're putting out a call for stories to address that intersectionality. How do stereotypes about gender and race intersect and affect our response to domestic violence and sexual assault? So you'll be hearing more from us about that as well. Thank you very much.
So I'm trying to find out from Heather or anyone else how much time we have left here with this panel. Got a little bit of time? Okay, so we have this incredibly talented audience here. What we heard largely is their problems, they're getting better. But what can we do to push this over the top? In each of your areas, if you could just take a real quick, how much time? 5 minutes. If you can each take like 30 seconds and just say what it is that the folks out here can be doing to get this over the finish line so that we in fact reverse what we have seen as a huge problem. Lynn, why don't you go ahead and start since you just finished?
I guess I would say local partnerships, the closer to the ground, building partnerships between domestic violence organizations and organizations within communities of color, building those partnerships to bring everyone's expertise to bear on this problem. And we as a federal government will serve as a partner in that effort.
Catherine?
So I hope you'll be active
partners in schools in trying to deliver high expectations and belief for all of our students. And one place you can be there in the P12 setting is with our civil rights data collection data, which is at ocrdata.ed.gov, and that has a picture of equity health delivered across many dimensions that includes sex, race, disability, status. And you can take a look at whether there's equity in your schools based on the data and whether there are more things that need to be done at a state level, at a district level, at a school level. Please use it to advocate for change in your school so that we can see more high expectations and better delivery across every dimension for our girls in schools.
Carol.
You're going to hear a theme here, and that's partnership and collaboration. And I think that what we'd like you to do is, again, think about how you look at these girls. I'm focused on the young folks now. And see them as our future leaders and expect the same things and outcomes for them that you want for your very own children. So be careful about the terminology you use and think about what your expectations are, and have high expectations for these folks, because they are going to be our future leaders. And there's so much talent locked up in all of these young girls that are vulnerable to these issues that we've been discussing.
Lateefah?
Yeah, I would echo my co-panelists, but also say that for so many years, many of these issues have been siloed. And I think it's how we talk about these issues when we are trying to drive local policy initiatives and to educate our constituents and the public, and that whether it's minimum wage or other issues that are not necessarily framed as women's issues, we know that across the board on many of these economic security issues that we're fighting and fronts that we're fighting, that women and women of color stand to gain the most or to lose the most if we're not successful. So I urge all of you to rethink your coalitions in some ways on how you get some of this work done, and perhaps bring some voices who aren't typically at the table but who are making great strides in these areas that perhaps don't see themselves as advocates for women but certainly are.
Myra?
I absolutely agree with my colleagues, but something that I think is a little bit unique to healthcare is that women are seen as the trusted voice when it comes to health issues. In a family, in a circle of friends, when you ask women in general, who do you trust for healthcare advice, for healthcare questions that you may have, it's their girlfriend, it's their mother, it's their sister. That's who we're going to. So each of us has an important role to play when it comes to spreading the word about the marketplace and new coverage opportunities for women across the country. With healthier women, we have healthier families, we have healthier communities, and we can do more to improve the health and well-being of girls across the country.
And Nadine?
So, that's okay. Similar to my fellow co-panelists, it is that essence of collaboration and understanding how, for us, health is a part of all of these sectors, all of these discussions, and understanding that it does vary community by community. And so the importance of having that type of grassroots collaboration, and also educating others in other sectors who may or may not see the role that health plays, because it impacts the workforce, it impacts us in education. Just recognizing the importance of really having that type of multi-sectoral partnership-based approach, because we really are dependent upon each other to see an end to these disparities.
So one last point of personal privilege is that two people from the team that I get to work with played a fundamental role with this report and in this work going forward. And that's Maisha Braden, who is here, and Becky Monroe, who is back there. And I was fortunate enough to steal both of them from the Department of Justice. With this, this has been an amazing panel. They are doing amazing work. They told you how you can help and join in this effort. With that, a round of applause for this great panel.